Welcome to Café Tales. I am Alie, your host for today's mystery. We're joining Father Brown today at the Grand Maven Opera House with the owl behind the curtains. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's ease into it. Father Brown and the Owl. Behind the Curtains, Chapter 1, The Sacred and the Profane. Father Brown had always maintained that the most deceptive buildings in the world were not prisons, where everything declares itself a prison, but places of entertainment, where everything declares itself free. Standing before the grand columns of the Maven Opera House, its marble facade gleaming like a pagan temple under the ice. Evening lights, he found himself thinking precisely this thought. The imposing structure seemed to him both inviting and vaguely threatening, as if its very beauty were a kind of trap. "Come along, Father," said Father Ambrose, his thin, musical voice carrying a note of impatience. "We'll be late for the first act, and Madame Veronique's entrance is not to be missed." Father Brown smiled apologetically and followed his colleague up the sweeping steps. Father Ambrose was one of those clerics who believed God spoke as clearly through Bach and Mozart as through any sermon, perhaps more clearly, and he had insisted, with unusual vehemence, that Father Brown accompany him to this performance of Tosca. The shorter priest had agreed with his customary humility, though opera struck him as unnecessarily complicated, both as music and as human behavior. The foyer of the Maven was a crowded kaleidoscope of jewels and evening dress, of perfume and hushed, important conversation. Father Brown's plain black cassock and round, unremarkable face made him nearly invisible among the splendor, which suited him perfectly. Father Ambrose, taller and more distinguished, with his silver hair and aquiline features, received several respectful nods as they made their way toward the grand staircase. "There's Mr. Harrington," Father Ambrose murmured, indicating a corpulent gentleman holding court near a marble bust of Puccini, the financial savior of the Maven. "They say without his patronage, this place would have closed its doors during the recession." Father Brown glanced at the financier with mild interest. "He looks more like someone who needs saving than someone who offers it," he remarked quietly. Indeed, despite Mr. Harrington's expansive gestures and loud laughter, there was something strained about his jovial demeanor. His eyes, deeply set in a face flushed with what might have been either excitement or high blood pressure, darted occasionally toward the grand staircase with an expression that seemed to Father Brown curiously like fear. As they ascended toward the boxes, they passed a thin, intense man with a shock of white hair, engaged in what appeared to be a forceful, one-sided conversation with a stagehand. "Conductor Keller," Father Ambrose whispered. "Brilliant but temperamental. They say Madame Veronique is the only singer he truly respects, or fears, depending on who tells the story." The stagehand, a sturdy young man with calloused hands and intelligent eyes, noticed Father Brown's gaze and offered a slight, almost conspiratorial smile before returning his attention to the conductor's tirade. "That's Thomas Blake," Father Ambrose continued as they moved past. "A good Catholic boy, actually. His mother is in my parish. Talented carpenter, makes most of the special stage pieces." Father Brown nodded absently, his attention caught by something else entirely. Through an open door leading backstage, he glimpsed a figure in a magnificent costume, presumably Madame Veronique herself, engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with a shadow partially concealed behind a curtain. The famous soprano's face was contorted with an emotion that was certainly not artistic temperament, but something closer to genuine fear. Before he could observe more, the door swung shut, and a bell chimed delicately through the foyer announcing that the performance would soon begin. Their seats, secured through Father Ambrose's connections with a wealthy parishioner, offered an excellent view of both stage and orchestra pit. As the lights dimmed and the first notes of the overture trembled in the air, Father Brown found his attention wandering from the music to the elaborate set being revealed as the curtain rose. The stage designer had created a strange, dreamlike version of a Roman church where perspective seemed deliberately askew and shadows fell at impossible angles. Among the various ornaments and decorations, Father Brown's eye was drawn to a large stuffed owl perched above what was meant to be an altar. The bird, with its glass eyes and spread wings, seemed oddly out of place in the ecclesiastical setting, neither sacred nor properly profane, but something uncategorizable. An interesting artistic choice, he murmured to Father Ambrose. Oh, the owl? Yes, apparently it's some reference to ancient Greek theater that the director insisted upon. Madame Veronique initially objected, I heard, but was eventually persuaded. Do be quiet now. The performance proceeded with all the expected dramatics, and Father Brown tried dutifully to appreciate the music that so moved his friend. Madame Veronique was indeed remarkable, her voice soaring above the orchestra with seeming effortlessness. Yet something about her performance struck the little priest as oddly mechanical, as if she was singing by rote rather than from the heart. During the intermission, as they stood sipping modest glasses of sherry in the crowded corridor, Father Brown noticed Mr. Harrington again, this time in conversation with the stagehand, Thomas Blake. The financier was speaking in low, urgent tones. His face flushed darker than before, while the younger man listened with a stony expression. Must be adjusted before the second act, Father Brown caught as they passed nearby. The angle is wrong, and she has noticed. It's set exactly as specified, Blake replied, his voice quiet but firm. Nevertheless, Harrington said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, it must be corrected. When they returned to their seats for the second act, Father Brown glanced again at the elaborate stage setting, now transformed into an ornate chamber. The owl had been moved, he noticed immediately. It now seemed to gaze directly at the spot where Madame Veronique would soon stand for her most famous aria, like a silent watcher, he thought, waiting for something only it could see. The house. Lights dimmed, and the terrible beauty of the music rose once more into the darkness. Chapter 2. A Silent Cry. The second act began with that peculiar hush that falls over an audience when collective anticipation becomes almost tangible. It was not merely silence, but expectancy clothed in silence. The difference, Father Brown reflected, between an empty room and one in which someone is hiding. The little priest settled back in his seat, his unremarkable features composed in an expression of polite attention that concealed his growing sense that something in this gilded temple of art was fundamentally wrong. The audience that surrounded them presented its own small theater of human vanity. In the box directly opposite, a duchess with a face like ancient parchment stretched over two sharp bones wore diamonds that caught the light with cold fire. Beside her sat a young attaché from some minor European embassy, whose attention kept wandering from the stage to the décolletage of his companion. 3 rows ahead, a famous literary critic scribbled notes with aggressive importance, as if waging war on the performance rather than observing it. "That's Lord and Lady Pembroke," whispered Father Ambrose, nodding toward a silver-haired couple in the adjacent box. "They've sponsored Madame Veronique since her debut," Some say a bit more than sponsored, at least on his part, though that was years ago. Father Brown's eyes flickered briefly toward the aristocrats. Lord Pembroke's face had the ruddy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, while his wife's expression held the practiced serenity that so often masks either saintliness or deep grievance. Neither seemed particularly engaged with the opera. The stage lights shifted, casting long shadows across the set as the orchestra swelled in anticipation of the diva's entrance. Father Brown's gaze returned to the decorative owl, now positioned in such a way that its glass eyes seemed to follow any movement below. There was something unsettling in the craftsmanship of the creature, too lifelike to be merely decorative, too still to be anything but dead. When Madame Veronique entered, it was with the practiced majesty of one who had long ago mastered the high art of commanding attention without appearing to seek it. She moved across the stage with deliberate grace, her elaborate costume catching the light like the plumage of some exotic bird. At 50, she was no longer young, but possessed that quality of beauty that deepens rather than fades with age, the kind of beauty that comes from absolute certainty in one's own significance. Father Brown noticed that she did not look once at the box where Mr. Harrington sat rigid with what might have been admiration or anxiety. Nor did she acknowledge the slight nod from Conductor Keller as the orchestra paused for her first notes. Instead, her eyes seemed momentarily fixed on the decorative owl, a flicker of something, recognition, apprehension, crossing her features, before the consummate professional reasserted control. Her voice, when it came, filled the cavernous space with astonishing power. It was not merely loud but penetrating, as if each note were a living thing seeking entry to the listener's soul. Father Ambrose closed his eyes in rapture, while all around the audience sat transfixed. "Remarkable control," murmured a woman behind them, "especially given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" her companion whispered back. "Haven't you heard?" "The threatening letters. Someone's been sending—" Father Brown did not turn around, but his ears, long accustomed to catching the significant in confessionals, had registered the exchange. His eyes remained on the singer, whose performance had taken on a strange, almost defiant quality. She was no longer simply playing a role, but seemed to be declaring something through her art, a challenge to some unseen adversary. The aria built toward its climax, each phrase more passionate than the last. Madame Veronique stood directly beneath the watchful owl, her arms outstretched in a gesture half supplication, half triumph. And then it happened. The transformation was so subtle that many in the audience didn't immediately realize anything was wrong. A slight falter in the voice, a momentary rigidity in the outstretched fingers. Only when the next note emerged as a strangled gasp did the truth become apparent. Madame Veronique's hand flew to her throat, her eyes widening in shock, or pain, or both. For one terrible moment, she stood frozen in a grotesque parody of her previous commanding presence. Then, as the orchestra continued for two confused measures before faltering into discord, she crumpled to the stage like a marionette whose strings had been abruptly cut. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds, though it seemed to Father Brown to stretch into infinity. Then came the inevitable chaos. A woman screamed from the upper circle. The conductor half rose from his seat, his baton still raised as if it were a weapon. Stagehands rushed from the wings. "Good God," breathed Father Ambrose. "What's happened to her?" Father Brown was already on his feet, his unimpressive figure somehow managing to slip past knees and elbows with the deftness of long practice at moving through crowded churches. By the time he reached the stage door, a small crowd had gathered, stagehands, chorus members still in costume, the harried stage manager attempting to restore order. "Is there a doctor?" someone was calling, though the tone suggested the question was mere formality. Through the press of bodies, Father Brown glimpsed Madame Veronique being carried into her dressing room. Her face had taken on a bluish tinge that no stage makeup could explain, and there was foam at the corners of her mouth. The little priest had seen death often enough to recognize its imminent approach. Inspector Grenville arrived with surprising speed, suggesting to Father Brown that perhaps the police had already been present in the building for some reason. The inspector, a tall, cadaverous man with a manner as dry as old parchment, began issuing orders with practiced efficiency. "No one leaves the building," he announced to the gathering crowd. "This may well be a case of poisoning." A collective gasp moved through the assembled theater folk like wind through tall grass. Father Brown, standing quietly in a corner where the shadows gathered most deeply, noticed three things in quick succession. Mr. Harrington, his face now ashen, slipping something into his pocket. Thomas Blake, the stagehand, staring not at the commotion but at the decorative owl still perched on its promontory. Conductor Keller, whose expression held not shock, but something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Above it all, the stuffed owl gazed down with its glass eyes, moved, slightly from its original position, as if it had turned its head to better observe the human tragedy unfolding beneath its silent watch. Chapter 3. The Locked Sanctuary. The dressing room of Madame Veronique had been transformed from a shrine of artistic vanity into something more solemn by the simple fact of death. The mirrors that had reflected her triumphs now reflected only the grim faces of Inspector Grenville and the police surgeon, who was completing his preliminary examination with the brisk efficiency of one who has seen too many corpses to be greatly moved by one more. "Poison, certainly," the surgeon announced, snapping his bag closed. "Something fast-acting and rather unusual, I'd say. Not your common arsenic or strychnine, something more theatrical." "How appropriate," murmured Inspector Grenville, whose desiccated humor rarely found appreciation among his colleagues. He turned to address the small gathering of officials and witnesses. "The facts, as we currently understand them, are these. Madame Veronique was in perfect health when she took the stage. She consumed nothing during the performance. No one entered her dressing room during the interval. This has been confirmed by the dresser, who stood guard as per Madame's standing instructions. And yet she collapsed and died within minutes of beginning the second act." Father Brown, who had been permitted to remain present due to Father Ambrose's insistence that last rites should be administered, though they had arrived too late for the sacrament, stood quietly in a corner of the room. His round face bore an expression of mild interest rather than the horror or excitement displayed by most others present. "A locked-room mystery, then," said Mr. Harrington, whose authority, as the theater's benefactor, had secured him entry to this restricted gathering, like something from a detective story. "Life rarely arranges itself with the convenience of fiction, Mr. Harrington," replied Inspector Grenville coolly. "There is always an explanation, however improbable it may initially appear." Father Brown coughed slightly, a small sound easily overlooked. "Perhaps," he suggested diffidently, "it is not a question of how someone got in, but of what was already here." All eyes turned toward the unimpressive priest, who seemed momentarily disconcerted by the attention. "Explain yourself, Father," the inspector prompted, with the weary tolerance of a man accustomed to sifting useful information from the chaff of amateur theorizing. "Oh, I haven't any explanation," Father Brown said apologetically. "Just a question, really. Has anyone examined everything in the room? The flowers, for instance. Some plants can release toxins, especially when heated by stage lights." The police surgeon looked thoughtful. "Not a bad suggestion. There are indeed botanical poisons that could cause such symptoms. We'll have everything tested." Inspector Grenville nodded curtly. "In the meantime, I'd like to speak with the dresser again, and the stage manager, and Mr. Keller, the conductor." As the various officials dispersed to their tasks, Father Brown found himself momentarily alone in the dressing room. With a glance that seemed casual but missed nothing, he surveyed the space that had been Madame Veronique's last worldly sanctuary. The dressing table was crowded with the usual paraphernalia of theatrical makeup, several vases of expensive flowers, sent by admirers, no doubt, a half-empty glass of water, and a small framed photograph turned face down. Father Brown righted the photograph with a gentle finger. It showed a much younger Madame Veronique with a small child, perhaps 3 years old, both smiling with uncomplicated happiness that seemed to belong to another lifetime altogether. "Touching, isn't it?" The voice made Father Brown turn. "Thomas." Blake, the stagehand, stood in the doorway. "She kept that hidden most of the time. Didn't like people knowing she had a daughter. Bad for the mystique, I suppose." "You seem to know a good deal about Madame Veronique," observed Father Brown mildly. Blake shrugged. "You pick things up working backstage. People forget you're there, like you're part of the furniture. You see things." "What sort of things did you see, Mr. Blake?" The stagehand's face closed like a door. "Nothing relevant to this. I should go. They'll be wanting us all for questioning." Father Brown nodded understandingly, but as Blake turned to leave, he added, "That owl is your work, isn't it? Very fine craftsmanship." Blake paused. "Yes. One of my special pieces." "How did you know?" "It has character," Father Brown replied simply. "Not many taxidermy creatures seem to watch an audience quite so attentively." Something flickered in Blake's eyes, surprise perhaps, or concern, but he merely nodded and left without further comment. In a moment, Father Ambrose reappeared, looking harried. "What were you discussing with that stagehand?" "I was just thinking about sanctuaries," Father Brown replied absently. "Sanctuaries?" Father Ambrose appeared puzzled. "Yes. Interesting places, both sacred and profane at once. Places where people feel safe enough to reveal themselves, yet also where they most carefully construct masks." Father Brown gestured vaguely around the dressing room, like confessionals in their way. Father Ambrose looked uncomfortable, as he often did when his friend became philosophical. "I don't see the connection to this terrible business." "Nor do I, clearly," admitted Father Brown with a sigh. "But I was thinking about silence, too. You mentioned once that in sacred music the silences matter as much as the notes." "That's certainly true," agreed Father Ambrose, warming to a subject dear to his heart. "The greatest composers understand that music exists in the tension between sound and its absence." "I wonder if the same might be true of this crime," mused Father Brown. "Perhaps what wasn't seen or heard matters more than what was." "Inspector?" Grenville reappeared at the doorway, his lean face set in lines of grim determination. "We've confirmed it was poison," he announced without preamble. And we've also confirmed that absolutely no one entered this room between her leaving it for the stage and her collapse. The flowers? Inquired Father Brown. Being tested, but the preliminary opinion is negative. Whatever killed her wasn't inhaled. Then we must consider what she encountered on stage, said Father Brown. Already considered, replied the inspector with a hint of impatience. She touched nothing, consumed nothing. The poison must have been administered before she went on stage, with a delayed effect. Or, suggested Father Brown quietly, it was administered to her while she was on stage, by someone who never entered her presence at all. Inspector Grenville's eyebrows rose slightly. An interesting theory, Father, and how exactly would that be accomplished? Father Brown spread his hands in a gesture of humble ignorance. I haven't the faintest idea. I merely observe that, when the impossible has been eliminated, we must reconsider what we believe to be possible. As they left the dressing room, Father Brown cast one last glance at the framed photograph, the image of past happiness now watched over by empty mirrors that reflected nothing but the lingering mystery of how a woman could be killed inside, a sanctuary that no killer had entered. Chapter 4. Voices in the Dark. The morning after the tragedy dawned with that peculiar grayness that seems less an absence of light than a presence of gloom. Father Brown, who had spent his early hours in prayer rather than sleep, sat in a small antechamber of the Opera House where Inspector Grenville had established a temporary headquarters. The room had once, perhaps, been elegant, but now bore the faded grandeur of a dowager whose jewelry has been sold off piece by piece. Theatrical posters from more prosperous seasons adorned the walls, including several featuring Madame Veronique in her prime, a woman whose command of her art was matched only by her command of her public image. Remarkable career, observed Inspector Grenville, following Father Brown's gaze to a particular poster showing the soprano as Tosca. From nothing to everything, and now back to nothing again. The eternal cycle of the theater, one might say. Not quite nothing, Father, Brown murmured. She leaves behind whatever truth she knew. The inspector looked at him sharply. Truth is precisely what concerns me, Father, and at present it remains frustratingly elusive. They were joined by Sergeant Mills, a solidly practical young man, whose methodical approach complemented his superior's more intuitive style. The reports on Madame Veronique's background, sir, he announced, placing a folder on the table. Father Brown, who had been invited to remain present more out of the inspector's vague sense that the priest might see things, others missed than from any official standing, listened quietly as the facts of the victim's life were catalogued with the impersonal precision of police work. Madame Veronique had been born Elena Vasquez in a small Spanish town, the daughter of a church organist. Her rise from provincial choir girl to international opera star had been meteoric, and according to some sources, orchestrated with calculated precision. She had one daughter, now grown and living abroad under another name. No current romantic attachments were known, though her past included several liaisons with influential men in the arts and finance, including our Mr. Harrington, Father Brown inquired mildly. The inspector's eyebrows rose slightly. Your powers of deduction are improving, Father. Yes, they had a relationship some 15 years ago, before his marriage. Ended rather abruptly, according to our sources. And Lord Pembroke as well, I believe, added Father Brown. Indeed. The good Lord seems to have been something of a patron to promising young sopranos, with his wife's apparent tolerance, if not blessing. The inspector's tone conveyed his opinion of aristocratic morality without requiring explicit statement. "And the daughter?" asked Father Brown. "What became of her?" Sergeant Mills consulted his notes. "Educated at exclusive schools, mostly abroad. Currently believed to be living in Switzerland. We're attempting to contact her." Father Brown nodded thoughtfully, his round face revealing nothing of his inner reflections. After a moment, he said, "I would like to speak with Thomas Blake again, if I may." There was something curious about his manner when we discussed the owl. "The stagehand?" "By all means," agreed the inspector, who had developed a grudging respect for the priest's unexpected insights. "He's waiting with the others." Blake, when summoned, entered the room with the careful movements of a man accustomed to navigating cluttered backstage spaces. His hands, calloused and strong, fidgeted slightly with a carpenter's pencil. "Mr. Blake?" Father Brown began conversationally. "You mentioned yesterday that you created the owl that featured so prominently in the production." "That's right, Father," Blake replied, his voice guarded. "One of my special pieces, as I said." "Special in what way?" Blake shrugged. "Just that it wasn't a standard prop. Madame Veronique initially objected to having it on stage, said it distracted from her performance. Then suddenly she changed her mind. Insisted on its exact placement, in fact." "When did this change of heart occur?" asked Inspector Grenville, suddenly alert. "About a week ago, after she received a letter that upset her." "A letter?" The inspector leaned forward. "What sort of letter?" "I don't know the contents," Blake said, his eyes darting briefly toward the door as if calculating an escape. "I just saw her reading it backstage. Her face went white and she crumpled it up. Later that same day, she told the director the owl must remain and precisely where it should be positioned." Father Brown had been studying Blake's face with gentle attention. "You heard something else, didn't you, Mr. Blake? A conversation not meant for your ears." The stagehand's jaw tightened. "As I told you, Father, backstage people see and hear things. Part of the job is pretending you don't." "Even when it might relate to a woman's death," pressed Inspector Grenville. Blake hesitated, then sighed heavily. "The night before the performance, I was securing the scenery. Madame Veronique was having an argument with someone in her dressing room. The door was ajar, and voices carry in an empty theater." "Who was she arguing with?" asked the inspector. "I couldn't see, but she said something like, 'You can't possibly think this will remain hidden. The notes make it clear, someone knows everything.' Then the other person said something I couldn't make out, and she replied, 'The owl watches everything, just like in the old plays.' It sounded, I don't know, like she was making a threat." Father Brown's eyebrows rose slightly. "The old plays? Did she specify which ones?" Blake shook his head. "No, but given the context, I assumed she meant Greek tragedies. The owl is sometimes a symbol in those, isn't it?" "Indeed," murmured Father Brown. "The owl of Athena, watching in wisdom over human folly." After Blake had been dismissed, Inspector Grenville turned to Father Brown with a puzzled expression. "Do you think this reference to Greek tragedy is significant?" "Everything is significant," replied Father Brown simply. "The difficulty lies in distinguishing between what signifies the truth and what signifies an attempt to obscure it." Later that afternoon, Father Brown found himself wandering the auditorium, now eerily empty of audience and performers alike. The stage, partially dismantled, resembled an abandoned temple after the departure of both gods and worshippers. The decorative owl had been removed, impounded as potential evidence, though no one but Father Brown seemed to consider it particularly relevant. From the shadows of the wings emerged conductor Keller, his thin frame seeming almost spectral in the half-light. "Contemplating the scene of the crime, Father?" he asked with a faint Germanic accent. "Or perhaps seeking divine inspiration?" "Neither, really," answered Father Brown amiably. "I was thinking about music and silence, and how one defines the other." "A philosophical priest," observed Keller with a touch of condescension. "How charming. But philosophy will not identify who killed Elena. Madame Veronique, as she preferred to be called." "You knew her before her transformation, then?" inquired Father Brown. A shadow crossed the conductor's austere features. "I discovered her, trained her, created her, you might say, before she discarded those who helped her rise." He made a dismissive gesture with long, elegant fingers. "Ancient history now." "And yet," suggested Father Brown gently, "history has a way of refusing to remain in the past, doesn't it? Particularly when it involves secrets." Keller's face hardened. "We all have secrets, Father. Even priests, I imagine. The question is, which secrets are worth killing for?" He turned and walked away through the shadowed backstage area, leaving Father Brown alone in the cavernous space where music and death had so recently intertwined. The priest stood for a long moment, his unimpressive figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the empty stage, his mind turning over the fragments of truth that had begun to form a pattern still too incomplete to reveal its final design, but suggestive enough to confirm his growing suspicion that in this case, as in so many others, the obvious explanation was precisely the one thing that could not possibly be true. Chapter 5. The financier's burden. It has often been observed that financial institutions, like churches, are designed to inspire awe through architecture. The offices of Harrington Financial occupied the upper floors of a building whose granite facade and imposing columns suggested permanence and unassailable security, qualities that, as Father Brown knew from long experience with human nature, were rarely as absolute as their physical symbols implied. Mr. Harrington received the priest in a corner office where the wood paneling and leather furniture spoke of traditional wealth, while the sleek computer equipment and modern art suggested contemporary relevance. The financier himself seemed to embody this same contradiction, old money manners wrapped around new money ambitions. "I appreciate your seeing me, Mr. Harrington," Father Brown began, settling his unremarkable figure into a chair that seemed designed for someone more impressive. "I understand you've already spoken at length with Inspector Grenville." "Indeed," exhaustively. Harrington's fingers drummed briefly on his desk, a momentary betrayal of nerves at odds with his composed expression. "Though I confess I'm puzzled by your involvement, Father. Are you assisting the police?" "Oh, no," Father Brown replied mildly. "Nothing so official. My friend Father Ambrose is naturally distressed by what happened at a performance he invited me to attend, and I find that understanding the truth often helps ease such distress." "The truth," echoed Harrington with a slight grimace. "A commodity sometimes more costly than gold, in my experience." "And yet one that cannot be hoarded or counterfeited," observed Father Brown with a gentle smile that somehow transformed the platitude into something more pointed. Harrington studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You want to know about my relationship?" with Elena, with Madame Veronique. Only insofar as it might help explain her death. That was 15 years ago. A brief affair, nothing more. She was rising in her career. I was building my business. Paths that crossed, then diverged. And yet, Father Brown noted, you became the primary financial supporter of the Mavin Opera House, where she performed. Quite a substantial commitment for someone whose interest in opera was casual. A flush crept up Harrington's neck. The opera house was a sound investment at the time, and a useful one for entertaining clients. An investment that has been losing money for 3 consecutive seasons, Father Brown remarked, according to the programs I examined. Fewer performances, smaller productions, and yet your support continued, unwavering. Harrington's composure slipped further. Have you been investigating my finances, Father? Merely reading publicly available information, Father Brown replied equably. Though I did have a most interesting conversation with Thomas Blake this morning about his work on theatrical properties, among other things. The change in Harrington's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible paling of the complexion. Blake? The stagehand? I barely know the man. Yet you were most insistent with him about adjusting the position of the decorative owl before the second act, Father Brown observed. An odd detail for a financial patron to concern himself with. Harrington rose and walked to the window, perhaps to hide his face from the priest's mild but disconcertingly perceptive gaze. I take an interest in production details. Is that so unusual? Not at all, agreed Father Brown. Though your specific interest in that particular prop is interesting, especially given what I discovered in the theater archives this morning. Father Brown had spent several hours in the dusty room where the Maven's records were kept, programs, financial statements, correspondence, assisted by an elderly clerk who remembered when the opera house had been the jewel of the city's cultural life rather than a struggling anachronism. The archives? Harrington turned back, his attempt at casual interest undermined by the tension evident in his posture. Yes, most enlightening. I was particularly struck by a pattern in the productions featuring Madame Veronique over the past decade. Did you know that a decorative owl appeared in no fewer than 7 of them? Different productions, different settings, from ancient Rome to revolutionary France. Yet somehow this same symbolic bird found its way into each one. I fail to see the significance, Harrington said, though his voice lacked conviction. Nor did I initially, admitted Father Brown, until I cross-referenced the dates with the opera house's financial records. Each production featuring the owl was followed by a substantial anonymous donation. Quite remarkable timing. Harrington returned to his desk but remained standing, as if prepared for flight. The opera world has many eccentric patrons with their superstitions. Perhaps someone considered the owl lucky. Perhaps, agreed Father Brown mildly, though in Greek mythology, the owl represents not luck but wisdom, particularly the wisdom of seeing in darkness what others cannot see in light. I'm afraid I know little of mythology, Harrington replied stiffly. That's odd, mused Father Brown, given that you have a first edition of Bulfinch's mythology on your bookshelf, and that you were once a classics major before switching to finance, according to your alumni biography. That silence that followed held the peculiar quality of a trap sprung, though neither man had moved. Finally, Harrington sank back into his chair. What exactly are you suggesting, Father? I'm not suggesting anything, Father Brown replied. I'm simply trying to understand why a successful financier would maintain financial support for a failing opera house, why he would take particular interest in a decorative owl, and why anonymous donations arrived with such predictable timing. Harrington's laugh held no trace of humor. You make it sound sinister. The truth is merely embarrassing. I continued supporting the opera house because Elena asked me to. The anonymous donations were mine, structured that way for tax purposes. As for the owl, it was a private joke between us, a reference to her fondness for Greek drama. And the argument you had with her shortly before her death, Father Brown asked quietly. Was that also about Greek drama? Harrington's face hardened. There was no argument. Whoever told you that is mistaken. Mr. Blake overheard raised voices, though not the specific content, Father Brown said. And he mentioned something about notes or letters that had upset Madame Veronique. Elena received hate mail regularly, jealous rivals, obsessed fans, occupational hazards for someone of her stature. Father Brown nodded thoughtfully. One last question, if I may. The daughter, Madame Veronique's daughter, what became of her? The change in Harrington was immediate and profound, like a man who has been struck physically. I have nothing to say about that, he whispered hoarsely. Nothing at all. Father. Brown rose, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Thank you for your time, Mr. Harrington. I won't trouble you further today. As he left the imposing offices, Father Brown reflected that there are few burdens heavier than secrets long carried, and few more dangerous than truths half exposed. The financier was hiding something significant. That much was certain. But whether his secrets were the kind that led to murder remained to be determined. Outside, rain had begun to fall, turning the city streets into mirrors that reflected the gray buildings above. Father Brown turned up his collar and made his way toward the workshop where Thomas Blake crafted the props and set pieces for the Maven Opera House, troubled by the conviction that the truth of this matter lay not in what had been said, but in what had been so carefully left unspoken. Chapter 6. Whispers and Echoes. The workshop of Thomas Blake occupied a cavernous space beneath the opera house, where the raw materials of theatrical illusion were transformed into the stuff of dreams. Father Brown, descending the narrow stairs that connected this underground realm to the world above, found himself in a place of organized chaos. Wood shavings and paint cans, half-finished backdrops and dismembered mannequins, all illuminated by stark electric bulbs that cast shadows as sharp as knife edges. Blake himself stood at a workbench, carefully applying gold leaf to what appeared to be a ceremonial scepter. He glanced up as Father Brown approached, his hands continuing their delicate work with the unconscious precision of long practice. I wondered if you might find your way down here, Father, he said without preamble. The police have already been, and gone. Yes, Inspector Grenville mentioned he'd interviewed you again, Father Brown replied, examining with apparent interest a grotesque mask that hung on a nearby wall. He seems convinced that Madame Veronique's death was motivated by professional jealousy, perhaps orchestrated by a rival singer. Blake's snort conveyed his opinion of this theory without requiring words. You disagree, prompted Father Brown. Elena, Vasquez, Madame Veronique, hadn't had real competition in 20 years, Blake replied, setting aside his work and wiping his hands on a cloth. When you reach that level, you're not worried about other singers. You're only competing. With your own legend, Father Brown nodded thoughtfully. You knew her by her real name. That suggests a longer acquaintance than most at the Maven had with her. A shadow passed across Blake's face. I knew her before she became Madame Veronique. We grew up in the same town in Spain. My mother was English, but she married a Spanish carpenter and settled there. Elena's father played organ at the church where my mother sang in the choir. So you followed her to England? Not exactly. I came here to study stage design. Finding Elena, Madame Veronique, at the Maven was coincidence, or fate if you prefer. Father Brown, who had never been entirely convinced of the distinction between the two, merely nodded. May I? He asked, gesturing toward a large sketch that lay partially covered on another workbench. Blake hesitated, then shrugged. It's the design for the owl, the one from the production. The drawing revealed not merely the exterior appearance of the decorative bird, but its internal construction, a complex arrangement of hidden compartments and fine mechanics whose purpose was not immediately obvious. Remarkable craftsmanship, observed Father Brown. Far more elaborate than a simple decorative element would require. Madame Veronique wanted it that way, Blake said, his voice carefully neutral. She had very specific requirements. For all her productions, including the placement of the owl during performances, added Father Brown, always watching over her, but never from quite the same angle twice. Blake's eyes narrowed slightly. You've been researching? It helps pass the time while Inspector Grenville pursues his theories, Father Brown replied mildly. I find theatrical history quite fascinating. The ancient Greeks, for instance, had such innovative stage mechanisms. Did they? Blake's tone was wary now. Oh, yes. Particularly for their deus ex machina moments, gods descending from above to resolve the plot. They used a device called a machine, rather like your owl. Their constructions often held secrets, inside seemingly ordinary objects. Blake abruptly gathered up the sketch and rolled it tightly. Is there something specific you wanted to ask me, Father? I have work to complete for the next production. Life goes on, even after tragedy. Indeed it does, agreed Father Brown, though sometimes it goes on differently than before. I was wondering if you had ever met Madame Veronique's daughter. The question hung in the air like a discordant note. Blake turned away, busying himself with organizing tools that were already meticulously arranged. Why would you ask me that? Because you knew her mother from childhood. Because you followed similar paths from the same small town to this grand theater. Because when I mentioned her just now, your hands stopped moving for precisely the length of time it takes a heart to skip a beat. Blake's shoulders tensed, then sagged slightly. Her daughter was a secret. Elena, Madame Veronique, kept her. Away from the public eye, away from the theater, but not entirely away, suggested Father Brown gently. No, Blake turned back, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. Not entirely. Before he could elaborate, they were interrupted by the arrival of conductor Keller, who descended the stairs with the imperious air of a man who considers himself above his surroundings. Ah, the investigating priest, he remarked with a thin smile. Still pursuing truths beyond the reach of official minds? I wouldn't put it quite that way, Father Brown replied amiably. I'm simply trying to understand a tragedy that seems to have many layers. Like an opera, observed Keller. Surface beauty concealing complex mechanisms, and often ugly truths. He turned to Blake. The director wants to know if the modifications for tomorrow's rehearsal will be ready on schedule. As always, Blake replied tersely. Keller's gaze lingered on the rolled sketch. Working on something new? Repairs to existing pieces. Nothing that would interest you. The conductor smiled thinly. You'd be surprised what interests me, Blake. He turned back to Father Brown. I understand you've been questioning Mr. Harrington today, digging into financial matters. Curious focus for a priest. I'm interested in all aspects of human behavior, Father Brown said mildly. Finance merely provides a different window into motivation. And what motivation have you attributed to Harrington? Keller asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I haven't attributed any, Father Brown replied. I'm still gathering information. Then let me offer some, Keller said. Harrington was obsessed with Elena. His support of the opera house was never about art or investment. It was about keeping her bound to him through financial obligation. When she finally threatened to leave, to accept an offer from the Metropolitan in New York, he realized his control was slipping. An interesting theory, Father Brown acknowledged, though it doesn't explain certain other elements of the case. Such as, prompted Keller, such as why Madame Veronique changed her mind about the owl's placement shortly before her death, or why anonymous donations followed each production featuring an owl, or why someone would use a method of murder, so theatrical it practically announces itself as such. Keller dismissed these points with a wave of his elegant hand. Coincidences and distractions. The owl is a red herring, Father. You're allowing yourself to be misdirected by dramatic props when you should be examining human passions, jealousy, obsession, control. Perhaps, Father Brown conceded with apparent humility, though in my experience, physical objects often speak more honestly than people. They have no reason to lie. As Keller departed, Blake turned to Father Brown with a troubled expression. He's wrong about the owl. It wasn't a red herring, it was a message. A message? From whom to whom? Asked Father Brown. Blake shook his head. I've said too much already, but if you want to understand what happened, you should watch tomorrow's rehearsal. Same production, different cast. The understudy will take Elena's role. Will the owl be there? Father Brown inquired. A replacement. The original is still with the police, but identical in every way that matters. Father Brown left the workshop pondering this cryptic advice, more convinced than ever that the truth of this murder lay not in conventional motives of passion or greed, but in some more complex interweaving of past and present, of hidden relationships, and secrets that someone had deemed worth killing to protect. The theatrical nature of the crime was not incidental but essential, a performance designed for specific eyes, carrying a message that only certain observers would fully comprehend. As he emerged into the fading afternoon light, he noticed a young woman watching the opera house from across the street, slender, dark-haired, with something in her posture that struck him as oddly familiar, though he was certain they had never met. When she saw him looking her way, she turned and walked rapidly around the corner, disappearing into the flow of city life like a ghost, retreating from the light of scrutiny. Chapter 7. The Silent Watcher. It is a curious property of theaters that during rehearsals, they possess an atmosphere entirely different from that of either a performance or an empty building. They become something intermediate, a place where reality and illusion negotiate their boundaries, where actors half inhabit their characters, and where the mechanisms of wonder are visible, yet still retain their power to transform. Father Brown, seated alone in the darkened auditorium of the Maven Opera House, found this liminal quality perfectly suited to his current state of mind, where facts and suppositions similarly awaited their final arrangement. On stage, the replacement cast worked through the second act of Tosca, where Madame Veronique had met her end. The understudy, a young woman with a powerful voice, but without that indefinable quality that separates mere talent from true artistry, sang with technically flawless precision through the very aria that had been interrupted by death 3 nights earlier. Inspector Grenville slipped into the seat beside Father Brown, his lean figure seeming to fold upon itself like a pocket ruler. "Still pursuing your theories, Father?" he asked in a low voice. "Merely observing," Father Brown replied mildly. "Though I appreciate that you've permitted me to continue my amateur inquiries alongside your professional investigation." "Professional? But apparently unsuccessful," admitted Grenville with uncharacteristic candor. "We've analyzed everything the victim ate, drank, or touched. We've interviewed every rival, colleague, and stagehand. We've even examined that wretched owl microscopically. Nothing." "Perhaps," suggested Father Brown, "you've been examining the wrong owl." The inspector's eyebrows rose significantly. "I beg your pardon?" "I mean," Father Brown clarified, "that you've been examining the owl as it is, rather than as it was during the performance. It's the same owl, Father, but positioned differently. I believe Mr. Blake mentioned that its placement was adjusted between acts." "Indeed. Mr. Harrington was quite insistent about it." Grenville frowned. "How would that matter? A poison is a poison regardless of where the prop sits. Unless," Father Brown ventured, "the position itself was somehow part of the mechanism." Before Grenville could respond, Thomas Blake appeared at the end of their row, gesturing discreetly for their attention. Father Brown rose and followed him to the back of the auditorium, the inspector reluctantly trailing behind. "I've set it up as we discussed," Blake said quietly. In the small rehearsal room, he led them to a windowless space where a precise replica of the stage set had been arranged in miniature. The replacement owl sat in exactly the position of the original on the night of the tragedy. "This is identical to the setup for the second act when Madame Veronique collapsed?" Father Brown asked, examining the arrangement with careful attention. "Precisely," Blake confirmed. "The owl's position was shifted between acts. That was standard. But on that night, Mr. Harrington insisted on a specific adjustment, which I've reproduced here." Father Brown walked slowly around the miniature set, his unremarkable face betraying nothing of his thoughts. Then he positioned himself where Madame Veronique would have stood during her fatal aria. "The angle is crucial, isn't it?" he asked, softly. "From here, the owl appears to be looking directly at the singer." "Yes," Blake agreed. "From the audience's perspective, it seems to be watching the entire stage, but from the performer's position, its gaze is focused solely on them." "Inspector." Grenville made an impatient gesture. "And this is all very theatrical, but I fail to see the relevance to a poisoning where no poison has been found." "Perhaps," said Father Brown, "because we've been thinking of the wrong kind of delivery system." He turned to Blake. "May I examine the owl more closely?" Blake hesitated, then nodded. "It's a replica, as I said, but constructed to the same specifications." Father Brown approached the decorative bird, studying it with the same gentle attention he might give to a confessing parishioner. Its glass eyes, realistically crafted, caught the light with an uncanny simulation of awareness. The feathers, carefully arranged over a wooden frame, appeared natural enough to fool any observer not specifically looking for artifice. The beak, Father Brown said suddenly. It's hollow, isn't it? Blake's expression remained carefully neutral. As in the original, part of the design, Father Brown nodded thoughtfully. And these small holes in the base, they allow for mounting at different angles. Yes. Depending on the scene requirements, the owl can be positioned to face in various directions or to align with specific targets. Father Brown suggested quietly. A flash of understanding crossed Inspector Grenville's face. You're suggesting the owl contains some sort of projection device? A propulsion device, Father Brown corrected gently. The owl doesn't merely watch. In the right configuration, it delivers. A blowpipe, Blake confirmed, his voice barely audible. Concealed within the body, aligned through the beak. When positioned at the correct angle and with the correct pressure, a poisoned dart, finished Grenville, his professional skepticism battling with dawning comprehension. But how would it be triggered? No one was near it during the performance. That, said Father Brown, is where the ancient Greeks prove instructive. They understood that distance creates not a barrier but a relationship, one that can be bridged by the correct mechanism. He knelt beside the miniature set and pointed to a nearly invisible wire running from the owl's base to a point offstage. A simple pull cord hidden among the usual stage rigging, the sort of device used for centuries in theaters worldwide. When activated, it would release a spring-loaded mechanism within the owl. Ingenious, admitted Grenville, professional admiration momentarily overcoming his frustration at not having discovered this himself. But who pulled the cord? That, said Father Brown, rising with a slight grunt of effort, is the question we must now answer, though I believe we can narrow our suspects considerably. How so? Asked the inspector. The triggering required precise timing and a clear view of the stage. It required intimate knowledge of the production and access to the backstage area. Most importantly, Father Brown continued, his mild gaze now focused on Blake. It required someone with the mechanical skill to design such a device and the opportunity to install it. Blake's face had gone very pale, but he met Father Brown's eyes steadily. I built it, he admitted. But I didn't trigger it. I would never. No, Father Brown agreed gently. I don't believe you would. But you know who did, don't you? Before Blake could respond, a movement at the door drew their attention. The young woman Father Brown had glimpsed watching the opera house stood there, her dark eyes moving from Blake to the priest to the inspector with weary calculation. Maria, Blake said, his voice cracking slightly. You shouldn't be here. I had to come, she replied, her accented English carrying echoes of her mother's voice. When I read about her death, I knew it had finally happened, what she always said would happen if the truth came out. Inspector Grenville straightened, his official demeanor reasserting itself. Young lady, I believe you and I need to have a conversation. Father Brown, watching the complex emotions play across the young woman's face, understood that they had reached the moment when long-buried secrets would finally emerge into the light. Secrets worth killing for, worth dying. Worth constructing elaborate mechanisms of deception to protect. Like the owl that had delivered death while seeming merely to watch, the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for the correct angle of observation to reveal its deadly purpose. Chapter 8. The Truth Behind the Curtain, The Maven. Opera House seemed to hold its breath as the principal actors in this final scene gathered on the main stage. Father Brown had requested this arrangement, and Inspector Grenville, now convinced of the priest's insights, had agreed. The great curtains were drawn back, the house lights dimmed to create pools of shadow between islands of harsh illumination. The effect was both theatrical and oddly ecclesiastical, as if the stage had been transformed into a secular altar where truth, not beauty, would be the offering. Mr. Harrington sat stiffly in a chair near the conductor's podium, his financial authority diminished by context, like a king removed from his throne to stand among commoners. Conductor Keller paced with controlled energy, his tall figure casting elongated shadows. Thomas Blake stood quietly beside Maria, whose resemblance to the dead soprano was more pronounced in this setting. The same proud carriage, the same capacity for both vulnerability and steel. Inspector Grenville completed the assembly, his notebook open but forgotten in his hand. Father Brown, his unremarkable figure somehow central despite its plainness, surveyed them all with the gentle compassion that was his most consistent characteristic. "I've asked Inspector Grenville to bring us together," he began, "because the truth of what happened to Madame Veronique, Elena Vasquez, is not simple, nor is it contained within a single heart. It's distributed among you, like the parts of a complex mechanism. Rather like your owl device," observed Keller with a thin smile. "A clever analogy, Father." "Not merely an analogy," Father Brown replied mildly. "The owl is quite literally at the center of this tragedy, not just as the instrument of death, but as a symbol chosen deliberately for its meaning." "Meaning?" echoed Harrington with forced skepticism. "It was a stage decoration, nothing more." "It was considerably more," Father Brown countered. "In Greek drama, the owl represents Athena, goddess of wisdom, but also of justice. It sees in darkness what others cannot see. It watches silently, then acts decisively." He turned to Maria. "Your mother understood this symbolism perfectly, didn't she?" The young woman nodded, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "My mother loved Greek tragedy. She often said modern audiences had forgotten what the ancient Greeks understood, that every action carries consequences that cannot be escaped." "Including her own actions?" Father Brown suggested gently. "Yes," Maria acknowledged, her voice steady. "Including hers." Father Brown turned back to the assembled suspects. "The mechanism of the murder is now clear. A blowpipe concealed within, a decorative owl positioned to deliver a poison dart at a precise moment. But the true mystery lies in why such an elaborate method was chosen, and by whom. Clearly by someone with access to the backstage area and technical knowledge," insisted Inspector Grenville, "which points to Blake here, who built the device but did not trigger it." Father Brown agreed. The triggering required not only technical skill but specific knowledge of the performance and perfect timing. It required someone who understood music intimately, who could anticipate exactly when Madame Veronique would reach her mark. Keller's pacing had stopped. "You're looking at me, Father." "With good reason," replied Father Brown. "You discovered Elena Vasquez, trained her, helped create Madame Veronique, and when she betrayed you professionally and personally, you orchestrated her final performance." "This is absurd," Keller declared, though his confidence seemed suddenly brittle. "Where is your evidence?" "Partly in what Blake has told us about the mechanism," Father Brown replied. "Partly in financial records showing your declining fortunes as Madame Veronique rose, but mostly in a comment you made earlier, a reference to Greek tragedy that betrayed specific knowledge of how the owl functioned." "What comment?" demanded Grenville. When we discussed the owl, Conductor Keller dismissed it as a red herring. That was directing our attention away from human passions, Father Brown explained. But I had never suggested the owl directed anything. Only someone who knew its true purpose as a directing mechanism for a poison dart would choose that particular word. Keller's face underwent a subtle transformation, from indignation to a cold, assessing calculation. Clever, Father, but circumstantial at best. Perhaps, agreed Father Brown. But there's more. The pattern of anonymous donations that followed, each production featuring an owl, donations that preserved the opera house during financial difficulties. Those didn't come from Mr. Harrington, despite his claim. They came from Madame Veronique herself. Harrington's composure cracked. That's impossible. She had no such resources. She had yours, Father Brown said simply. Or rather, the resources you provided for your daughter. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only when Maria spoke. He didn't know, she said, her eyes on Harrington. My mother never told him I was his daughter. She used his money, given as support for my education abroad, to keep the opera house afloat. That's what the owl signified. It watched over me from a distance, just as he unknowingly watched over both of us through his financial support. Harrington's face had gone ashen. Elena told me the child died at birth, he whispered. She said it was better that way, with my marriage approaching. And when you learned the truth? Asked Father Brown gently. A letter, Harrington admitted. Anonymous, with photographs of Maria, her birth certificate. I confronted Elena before the performance. She admitted everything. How she had used me, used my guilt and regret, to finance her career and the opera house. Which you overheard, Father Brown said to Keller. From your position in the orchestra pit, you, who had been her mentor, her lover, her collaborator, reduced to a mere employee while she manipulated Harrington for decades. She destroyed my career to build hers, Keller said, his voice suddenly free of pretense. When I discovered her deceit with Harrington, she ensured I was blacklisted from every major opera house, except this failing institution she kept alive for her own vanity. Then to learn she had been extracting money under false pretenses all these years. He stopped abruptly. So you designed her death as a performance, Father Brown concluded, with Blake's unwitting help in creating the mechanism. And with the owl, symbol of watchful justice, as the instrument. There is a certain artistic symmetry to it, Keller acknowledged, his professional pride apparently overcoming caution. She who lived by theatrical illusion, dying by the same. The timing of the dart with the precise note in her aria, when her lungs would be fully expanded, maximizing the poison's effect. The owl watching over her final performance. Inspector Grenville stepped forward. I believe that constitutes a confession. Anton Keller, I am arresting you for the murder of Elena Vasquez, known as Madame Veronique. As Keller was led away, Father Brown turned to Maria and Harrington, who stood regarding each other with the awkward intensity of blood relatives meeting for the first time with full knowledge of their connection. The truth is rarely simple, Father Brown observed quietly, and often more painful than the lies we construct to avoid it. Did you know from the beginning? Asked Harrington. About Maria? About Keller? No, admitted Father Brown. but I suspected that whatever drove someone to create such an elaborate method of murder must itself be elaborate, a web of relationships and resentments built over many years. In my experience, the most ingenious crimes often spring not from sudden passion but from old wounds left to fester in silence. As they departed the theater, now truly empty, with even the ghost of Madame Veronique's final performance exorcised by truth, Father Brown reflected that perhaps the owl had indeed served its ancient purpose as Athena's symbol. It had watched in darkness, seen what others could not see, and ultimately revealed a truth that had hidden behind the curtains of deceit for over 20 years. The rain had stopped, and stars were appearing in the darkening sky above the city. Father Brown turned up his collar against the evening chill and made his way toward the small church where he would say his evening prayers for the soul of Elena Vasquez, for her daughter and the father who had not known her, and even for Anton Keller, whose artistic brilliance had been corrupted by bitterness into an instrument of destruction. For Father Brown understood what the ancient Greeks had also known, that tragedy springs not from simple wickedness but from the complex interweaving of human virtues and frailties, talents and flaws, truths and deceptions that constitute the eternal mystery of the human soul. Thanks for joining us for The Owl Behind the Curtains. Did you suspect Conductor Keller before Father Brown revealed the connection to the mechanical owl? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Father Brown, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Father Brown's wisdom. The truth is rarely simple, and the most ingenious crimes often spring not from sudden passion, but from old wounds left to fester in silence. This is Alie, signing off from Café Tales.